broadly, the grid can cope.
Yeah, fantastic. And Graham, this is one of the reasons I wanted to have a chat with you, because we all see the comment sections and the Twitter comments under things. We go, oh, but what happens when everyone goes electric? The grid can't cope. And my point is, have you ever asked them? Like National Grid do exist. You can. They're modelling this. I mean, your future energy
model this,
scenarios. Yeah, and I always find your answers rather compelling. Particularly your 2002 stat, I think, is a real killer. It's a hell of an answer to what your date you'd have the phase out of electric vehicles, because it didn't include a date. So I'm going to push you for one now. Can you do that, or is politician Graham not allowed to say?
No. So what can I say? So we have supported a number of trade bodies and customers of National Grid with their response, right? Mm-hmm. So what we have said, even in our own response, because don't forget we've got 2,000 cars and 1,000 vans on our company fleet, so we're a big fleet owner as well. So we've responded, and we've said 2035 is fine. However, we do believe it is possible to do it earlier. From a grid perspective, it is possible, to do it earlier. Whether we can get the supply of vehicles in, whether we can move hearts and minds and educate people, but from a grid perspective, 2035, 2032, even 2030. I think the thing for me is, this is less about the engineering, more about politics. Sure. So, if you look what's driving this, if you look at the Committee on Climate Change, they say, to be in net zero, we have to stop selling cars that burn anything by 2035, because the average life of a car in the UK is 13.7 years. Sometimes it goes up, or depending on which year, it goes up or down a month, but 13.7 years, which means if you want to be net zero by 2050, you can't sell anything that burns a fuel after 2035. That's what set 2035.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then you get the politics of politics. The Scots have come out and said 2032. So now you've got Holyrood versus Westminster on the politics game. So at that point, is it engineering? Is it science? Or is it politics? So it'll be really interesting to see what date they actually come up with and what policy levers they put in place.
Absolutely. And clearly implicit in your answer there is the other factor as part of the consultation is, what date do you back, and should it include or exclude hybrid?
Yep.
And very clearly, you're saying it has to be zero emission, and we'd agree with you. I think hybrids have a role, and plug-in hybrids as a transitional technology, but for exactly the reason you said, if you want to hit the Committee of Climate Change, that's why they've advised 2035. If you want to hit 2050, you've got to go by at least 2035. Very true. Graham, you've done brilliantly. You've managed to cover a whole load of areas that I wanted to question you on, which is absolutely brilliant. So a couple of the outstanding ones. So I've spoken to you a few times before. I know one of your bugbears as an EV driver, or one of the areas that you're concerned about, and this has come up in the future energy scenarios as well, is provision of high-powered charging. Now, at Pod Point, we are always of the mantra that actually they do the minority of charging. Most of your charging will happen at home, etc., at places where you leave your car. But when you're out and about, and particularly if you're driving a larger batteried car, and they are starting to get bigger and bigger, you need high-powered charging out and about. And you need that at scale in strategic locations. So the government has come out with Project Rapid. The scope of that is, I understand it, that the government are looking at providing some financial support for the grid for these locations, a handful of locations to provide a large number of rapid chargers, but potentially hydrogen, etc., in the fullness of time. Remarkably similar to your own proposal, Graham. I would suggest that you've been taking around since about 2017-18. You must be pleased to see that in the works.
Yes, it's really good. But let's come back to why it was our recommendation, right? So let's put it this way. If the transition to decarbonising transport goes swimmingly well, nobody's going to thank National Grid, or the energy networks for that instance, right? But the minute this doesn't go well, who are you going to blame, right? Because anything electric is somehow the grid's fault, right? Mm. So in the same way, when I was a wind farmer, we were all blaming the grid, right, in the broadest sense, for the slow deployment of wind. So where I came from is I'm trying to not repeat the experience of the growth in renewables. So what I did is I asked loads of people in the industry, and that included you, obviously, what is it you're trying to do? How are you trying to do it? And what do you need National Grid to do? And generally your response was, where cars are stationary, it's going to happen at home and workplace. Fully agree. High power en route charging is likely to be 7, 8, 9% of energy transferred to a car, probably. But what we heard from so many people was it was critical to the success of the whole market. You know that charging is a mosaic of solutions. There is not one size fits all. And people are really strange, fickle beasts. We do not buy for average. We buy for the biggest journey we'll ever do. And so really what we heard from a number of stakeholders was to get mass uptake, you needed confidence. So forget the discussion about range anxiety. This is about confidence. Confidence that you are not impeded in what you want to do. And the only way to get confidence is to have charging that's, you have continuity and consistency. Now, the problem that you've got around motorway service areas is, from a grid perspective, motorway services are halfway between somewhere and somewhere else. They are on the end of the grid, right? And the biggest problem you've got is those grid connection upgrades are expensive by the nature of where they are. So the problem is, as a business model, you're being asked to stump up a lot of money for a big grid connection that you're going to have to live with for 40 years on a business model that's probably 5 to 7 years long, at a location where you're not sure how many EVs have been sold yet to know how many people are going to charge. I mean, that's a really difficult sell for anyone. So what was observed was, don't meddle with the charging market, because people like Pod Point are doing a great job, great product, offering the right solution for the right location. But the thing that was sort of hobbling everybody was the disproportionate nature of the underlying grid cost. And so so government only interfere when they see a failure in a market. Usually markets fix most things. And what they observed is, to get that continuity and confidence, you need to kind of fix that high power en route charging. And actually, it's kind of a bit like that Field of Dreams moment. If you had enough grid capacity, then the charging companies would bid in to provide it, right? So you're not having to hide the cost of the grid connection in your charging. So we went away, we've got a grid network. Literally, we chucked car traffic data into our electrical model. We took the road data and put that into our grid network model. And all we did is turn the handle and said, where are the optimum nodes? And it came up, and it just so happened they almost matched to 54 of the motorway service areas. So that's where we came at this. But actually, what we've seen from Project Rapid is an evolution on that. We thought it was a good starter for 10. Government are actually more ambitious. What they've come out with, they've said, is we want to see 6 high-powered chargers at every MSA by 2032. No, 2023.
22, yeah.
So 2023. I've got my number dyslexia on. 2023, right? 6.
Yeah.
But what they've also said is they're expecting by 2035 to need 6,000 high-power en route chargers. Now, if you look at the sort of locations where that will be, you could see a busy motorway service area needing 30 or 40 high-powered chargers to replicate the 20 petrol pumps they have now.
I believe Cobham was somewhat more than that. I think it was off the record given at one of these sessions, and I don't think it made 3 figures, but it was large. Yeah,
it was very large. But you see, the interesting thing is, when you look electrically, a traditional motorway service area. Now think about all the light bulbs, the Pizza Express, the whatever you get at the gaming machines, right? Typically, a motorway service area has a 1 megawatt grid connection, right? 6 high-powered chargers need a 1.25 megawatt grid connection. So actually, instead of having, the order of magnitude is huge. So, basically what you're going to need is somewhere between an 8 and a 15 megawatt grid connection at every motorway service area. Trying to get that out of the business model of charging pence per kilowatt hour for a charge point that's nuts, which is why you see this 500 million, which is trying to kind of future-proof that grid connection. So it'll be interesting to see, because at the moment we kind of have that pathway, but we don't actually have the policy piece nailed down as to how are they going to spend that money, how is it going to work. But we'll see that probably by the back end of the year or early next year.
Yeah, absolutely right. And very much in the early phases, and seeing how it develops will be very interesting. Talking of which, and I end this chat, Graham, on a bit of policy. So
yeah.
I guess one of the things that I know you very much support, you mentioned National Grid's vehicles, is incentivising BEV over PHEV, so full battery electric over plug-in hybrid. And you're a man talking from experience here, because you've got one of each, haven't you? But you're quite passionate. We see plug-in hybrid as a valuable transitional technology, but a transitional technology, BEV being the ultimate solution.
Yep.
To some extent, you want to bypass that step, don't you, for your van fleet, etc.?
Yeah, so, well, there's a few things. So statistically, and this is a stat from about 18 months, 2 years ago, 41% of plug-in hybrids have never been plugged in, right? And this was the fleet, I think it was the BVRLA, the trade body for the fleet industry, and 51% of all new cars sold are company vehicles. So they started literally lifting the boot lid and hadn't even broken the seal on the cable bag, right? So that kind of tells you kind of how bad that is. We did a bit of a straw poll on some of our users, and we found that, not everyone had plugged them in. So what you see there is a bit of a disconnect between you're not getting the benefit for that plug-in. But I'd also say, as a real-world experience, I'm a knowledgeable buyer. I knew I was buying a plug-in hybrid, and I knew that I would use it as much as I could in electric form. But because the batteries are so small, they'll tell you in the brochure that you'll get 50, 60, 70 miles per gallon. I call foul. Mine is used mainly for school runs, which means it's doing 5 or 6 miles. But one day a week, I was going up to Warwick, out from my home in Wokingham up to Warwick to my office there, and that one journey a week was outside the range of the car. And my average for the 35,000 miles that my car's done, I've averaged 30 miles per gallon.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So the cold reality is, yes, I'm using it in electric only mode most of the time. But on the time when you look at the whole life of the car, the time that you own it, and I'm at best achieving an average of 30 miles per gallon, you realise that the plug-in hybrid technology really is very short-term transitional. So when we look at it as a business, we've actually looked at our company car policy, and now you're in a spot now where you're incentivised to go full electric, and if not, you're probably better to have one more turn of the latest Euro 6 diesel, because actually what we've seen from plug-in hybrids within our own fleet is our costs have gone up, but also our efficiency's gone. The savings that we were supposed to be realising through emission savings have not been realised. So why would you keep doing something that increases your cost and you don't get the environmental benefit? So that's why, from our perspective, we've mandated our entire fleet will be alternatively fuelled by 2030. And actually, we've got our first 30 electric vans on fleet, the next 30's on order, and actually we've got something like 280 company cars, electric company cars on order, and that's growing all the time. So, I think, plug-in hybrid has a role, but I think there is a cold reality that most people aren't realising actually what it said on the tin.
Fair enough, Graham, fair enough. And you certainly put your money where your mouth is in terms of supporting those electric vans you've got on your fleet, because I quickly went to National Grid UK's website ahead of our call, and there you are, smiling in a Nissan ENV 200, which is great to see.
Yeah.
We agree with you. I think we're probably a little more optimistic on the PHEV. I think the journey from Wokingham to Warwick is really a long way beyond the range. Those with a shorter commute can make sense of them. But I think the
I agree.
logic that you're saying is very right. I think if you're driving long distances, then PHEVs really are not going to get the sort of the miles per gallon that you're promised, etc. Right. Going to ask you with your politician hat again.
Yep.
Have you got any other sort of upcoming policy matters of interest to us?
Yeah, there's probably 2 or 3 which are of direct correlation to transport decarbonisation and EVs specifically. So let's try and pick them in the order in which we're likely to see them. So we've got Treasury's National Infrastructure Plan coming. Now, Treasury, once every political cycle, they ask the National Infrastructure Commission to do an assessment of what infrastructure the country needs. And that includes everything, from runway capacity, broadband, fibre, the whole lot. What was in their last advice to government was make sure you've got enough underlying grid infrastructure for 100% EV sales by 2030. Now, it's not saying that there would be, but the least regret things for the country to do is to have the underlying grid capacity. Now, Treasury have been thinking about this. They've sat on it for a while. We've had Brexit, general election, Corona, so it's been delayed. But what we'll probably see in the autumn statement from Rishi Sunak is that the National Infrastructure Plan. So we ought to be looking out for that, because that's likely to talk about what they're going to spend on roads, but more importantly, what we're going to spend on electrifying transport, or at least the infrastructure for that. So that's the first one. The second one is, so currently, Department for Transport are working on a decarbonisation of transport plan. And that's everything. That's road, rail, aviation and maritime. But actually, it's got to be quite groundbreaking, because it's going to advocate that we travel less, is the first thing it's going to say. The Department for Transport, the first thing they're doing is say don't. So they're going to have to come up with a whole bunch of policy levers around travel less. If you do have to travel, can you do active travel? So, walking, cycling. Then it's a case of, can it be public transport, but make it clean? Then private transport, but can it be shared? And then the final one is, a private vehicle. That is going to report as a transport plan in the autumn. Now, this is a political autumn, so could be as late as Christmas. Actually, it could roll into the new year, but that's going to be really important. It's the first decarbonisation of transport plan that the UK has ever come up with. And it's also likely to be part of the foundation on what happens on COP26 and our commitments to the rest of the world in next November. And then the final one is the Committee on Climate Change. You mentioned them before. So in the first week of December, the Committee on Climate Change are going to release their 6th carbon budget. So we have legally binding carbon budgets, 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way out to 2050. Now, the 6th carbon budget is quite important, because it's the period 2033 to 2037. If we are not significantly on the trajectory to net zero by the mid-2030s, we will never make it. Mm-hmm. So what we're likely to see is almost the warning shot fired as to how fast we really need to run to be on that trajectory. And if you think about it, 2033 is only 12 and a half years away. Yeah. Right? So that's why that's going to be important as well. What they'll also do when they do that 6th carbon budget is the 4th and 5th carbon budgets were on the 80% reduction trajectory, not net zero. So they will revisit the 4th and 5th carbon budgets. Now, on our trajectory on the 4th carbon budget, we're a little bit behind the curve. If you restate that for net zero, we're a bit further behind the curve. So what you're likely to see is those three things come together and really sort of put the rocket under policy to really nail down some very decisive actions on the decarbonisation journey. So I guess it's a case of watch this space. Enjoy your summer, because it's going to be a really interesting autumn, for our industry and our sector.
Fantastic. Graham, thank you so much for that overview. Certainly it's felt a fairly interesting time all year, if not for several years. So certainly we look forward to the autumn. Graham, thank you so much for joining us and giving us some of your insights today.
No, that's great. Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you, and I hope it's been helpful.
Very much so. Thank you.
That's great. Take care. Bye-bye.
And scene.
And we're done.